This is a 20-mile-high tower in Mare Crisium, photographed by astronauts on Apollo 16, including John Young, who flew as the command module pilot on Apollo 10. This is a stolen photograph, okay? This was brought to me by someone who happened to be in NASA headquarters visiting the administrator's office, the administrator of NASA back then. And he was a contractor. And apparently they had just delivered a whole bunch of prints to the NASA administrator from the photo lab in NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. So there this guy is, works for a contractor, is left alone in the NASA administrator's office while the administrator went down the hall. Maybe went to the John or something. And he's, you know, kind of bored, and he gets up and he starts looking at these photographs from Apollo 16, and he sees this print. And he steals it. He takes it. And literally puts his briefcase and says, oh, I'll be back. I don't have time to wait, you know, for, I forget the name of the administrator. And he leaves. 40 years later, he meets me in Weehawken and hands me the print with this story. When we went to NSDC, I looked and looked and looked, and every version of this, this frame number, every version had been blacked out. This had been totally removed. If this print hadn't been purloined from the desk of the NASA administrator and physically handed to me decades later, we would not know that there was this astonishing, and we have real close-ups, and I don't have time to go into it. Some of them are in the book. You'll read the context, you'll read the story. The point is that it's because of these courageous Americans that we have any idea what has been hidden from us for all these years. This goes back to Bob Pirtek and his grid model, because all of this stuff is basically part of this overarching larger set of domes or grids that are over, I believe, each of the visible mare on the visible side of the moon. Those black splotches that are so high in titanium, I believe the titanium is the residue of the battered lunar domes on which the glass was hung. The titaniums are the frames, and the glass is the material that allows sunlight to come through and to allow people to live on the moon in this airless environment in Earth-like conditions. Now, here we have another Apollo 10 view. This is 4822. This is what I call the castle. This is suspended in midair about 9 miles above the surface of Sinus Medi. And you'll notice there's this strange obscuration. You can see features over on this side, you know, craters with pretty sharp edges and sunlight coming from this direction. But as you move from left to right in the photograph, the surface detail becomes more and more and more obscured, like there's something in the way. Again, that cannot be. On an airless world, that cannot be. This now is one of my favorite shots. This shows the castle and shows this amazing wire, this cable, which is like a catenary curve. It's like you had a huge weight, and it's pulling down the cable into this beautiful arc that extends above the lunar surface. And there's more junk down here. If you lighten this up, you can see grid. This is now a close-up. Here's the top of it. Here's the cable. Now the cable and the fact that it's sagging indicates we're looking at real weight, real mass, real objects, real stuff, not photographic defects. How the heck would a photographic defect know to make a curved gravity catenary cable? It couldn't. This now is even further evidence. This is the photograph I got from NSSDC from sources. This is a similar photograph, labeled, by the way, with the same frame number, but clearly it's a stereo. It's a different aspect ratio, just like the battleship, the thing that's as big as the battleship on the far side of the moon. They were going by it, and they photographed it here, and then they photographed it here. This probably was the later picture. All right, I should actually have them reversed, because you can see it's narrower, and it's thinner because you're moving away from it at a different angle. This one also has the same frame number. This, by the way, is how we figured out and came to realize that there's a lot of film in the NASA archives, all archived under the same frame number. We found 12 different versions of 4822. Now, does that mean that there are like 12 copies of every frame they made public? No. What we think they did is they made certain multiple passes with the Hasselblads, taking picture, 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 and they put those together as a movie, as a basically 70 millimeter IMAX movie of certain features that they were flying by, like these glass towers that they wanted to see the structure, and they couldn't see on the 16 millimeter film. Then we have, here's the castle, here's the crater called Menelaus. This is a grid. Notice now what the obscuration is. It's all this incredible regular geometric stuff, seen now not from the surface like the Shepherd shot that Ken preserved, but from orbit, looking down. So what Firtek did, this by the way is another version of 4822. What Firtek did is he put all this data together and again constrained further his glass grid model, which then allowed us to do something amazingly cool. This is now the 60 millimeter Mauer camera film that is in the window. They had basically a gun camera mounted in the window of the lunar module looking out at the moon as they simulated their landing. And they did an Earthrise. They actually turned on the camera and photographed Earthrise above the horizon of the moon. What's wrong with this picture? Why isn't it round? Watch this. This is actually the distortion as it rose above the moon. These are still frames grabbed from the video transfer of the film. This is a sequence of moonrise taken from Skylab, showing what happens when you look at an object through an optically active medium, the Earth's atmosphere in this case. You get what's called refractive distortion. It basically squidges it down so it's an oblate football shape as opposed to a round ball. And then as it rises higher, the distortion gets less because the density of the air gets less. The refraction, the bending of the light becomes less, and it's more and more normal. And then when you photograph it in space against a vacuum, there's no distortion at all. This, by the way, is a test to show that it was not the windows of the spacecraft. The windows are very expensive, polished quartz windows, optically flat to within 1/1000th of a wavelength or something. So no distortion in the windows. The distortion is caused by the rising of the Earth seen through some kind of optically active, refractive, light-bending capable medium, i.e. the lunar domes. This is now a sequence of the last few seconds of the Earthrise photographed with this film. And what the astronauts did is, when the Earth had risen, they mechanically hit a switch in that window and they cut the camera off. They cut the power to the camera. The camera's a mechanical system, right? The film's going through sprockets, there's inertia, it winds down. When you stop a motion picture camera, it never stops. It winds down and then stops. So what's happening is that the shutter is opening for longer and longer, and the film is being exposed for longer and longer, so you're getting oversaturation in these final frames. And what happened is you can see that every other frame you were seeing some kind of optical structure, and finally when it stopped, you see this incredible battered surface at the top of these horizontal striations that are the layers of the glass grid, and you can barely see the Earth superimposed between two layers, and there is the meteor-bombarded top of the dome structure. What Firtek did was to take his computer model and do what's called a ray trace. In other words, if you're building this glass grid and it's three-dimensional, like a super Rubik's Cube,